Let me tell you about the day Sharon Whitmore accidentally froze her own pipes and nearly destroyed her kitchen, all because she decided to park her Cadillac Escalade sideways across my driveway during the worst blizzard our county had seen in 30 years. She thought she was punishing me. She had absolutely no idea she was punching herself directly in the face. My name is James Webb, and I've lived at 14 Birchwood Lane for going on 11 years now. I bought the house because it had a big yard, a detached garage, a solid, well-insulated basement, and a price that made sense for a single guy who works in mechanical contracting. The neighborhood, Cedarwood Estates, is one of those planned communities from the mid-90s that has mature trees, decent roads, and a homeowner association that used to be reasonable before Sharon Whitmore got herself appointed to the board 3 years ago. I say appointed because nobody actually ran against her. She put her own name on the ballot twice, and both times she was the only candidate. People in this neighborhood were either too busy or too scared to challenge her, and Sharon had a way of making things very uncomfortable for anyone who did. She was the type who drove around on weekend mornings with a clipboard and a thermos of coffee, cataloging violations. Garbage bins that weren't rolled back in by 8 in the morning. Christmas lights left up past January 15th. Flower beds that she decided were not color-coordinated with neighborhood aesthetics. One time she issued a formal violation notice to a retired schoolteacher named Gerald Patterson because his mailbox post was, and I am quoting directly from the notice here, slightly askew from true vertical. She had brought an actual level to the mailbox. Gerald was 81 years old and had a bad hip. He cried about it at the next community meeting, and Sharon sat there completely unmoved, clicking her pen and explaining that standards existed for a reason. I had my own history with Sharon going back about 2 years. It started with my propane setup. See, my house is heated by propane, which is not unusual out here where we're a little removed from the natural gas main. I've got a large tank buried in my backyard, and twice a year a delivery truck from Ridgeline Propane comes to top it off. The truck is big. It's one of those white tanker trucks with the company logo on the side, and it needs to back into my driveway to reach the fill port with the hose. The whole process takes maybe 45 minutes including the paperwork. The truck parks partially in the street during the approach, which is standard procedure for any large delivery vehicle in a residential neighborhood, and has been perfectly legal and fine for the entire decade I've been getting propane deliveries. Sharon decided it was a violation of HOA Rule 12, Section C, which addressed commercial vehicles being parked in residential areas for extended periods. She sent me a written notice after the first delivery she witnessed, claiming the truck had been improperly parked. I wrote back explaining it was a utility delivery and therefore exempt under both the HOA bylaws and local municipal code. She sent a second notice saying her interpretation of the rule stood. I ignored it. She escalated to a $15 fine. I ignored that too. She tried to get the HOA board to authorize towing the truck on future deliveries, but 2 of the other 3 board members, a guy named Phil Nakamura and a retired nurse named Dorothy Sims, told her that was insane and voted her down. Sharon did not forget. Sharon never forgot anything. She kept a mental ledger that would have impressed an IRS auditor, and she added my propane truck situation to the account she was running on me. Now here's a piece of information that becomes very important later, so pay attention. About 4 years before I moved in, the previous owner of my house had a rather innovative plumbing setup installed. The neighborhood sits on a gentle slope, and during certain winters, the ground freezes deep enough that the water service line coming from the street main can get dangerously cold where it passes through sections of uninsulated earth. To deal with this, the previous owner, a mechanical engineer by training, had installed a radiant pipe heating system. Basically, there's a network of heating cables and insulated conduit that runs underground along the path of my water and propane lines, and it loops through a section of yard that, due to the way the lots are laid out in this cul-de-sac, technically passes under the corner of Sharon Whitmore's property line and comes back around to my service panel. This is completely documented. It's in the original property deed as an easement. My lawyer had reviewed it when I bought the house. The heating system is powered by my electrical panel, controlled by a thermostat in my basement, and it keeps the underground pipes from freezing when temperatures drop below a certain threshold. The loop under the corner of Sharon's yard is maybe 30 feet of cable running about 18 inches underground. It doesn't affect her yard in any visible way. There's no equipment on her surface, no markers, nothing she could see or notice. Her grass grows over it just fine. Her landscaper mows over it every summer without knowing it's there. And as far as Sharon was concerned, that corner of her yard was just a corner of her yard. She had no idea it was being kept from freezing by my system. She had no idea that if my system went offline, that 30-foot loop would go cold, the ground around it would freeze, and eventually the water service line that runs in close proximity to it through that same corridor would be vulnerable to a hard freeze. She had no idea about any of this when she parked her Escalade across my driveway on the morning of February 8th. Let me back up and give you the setup, because the context matters. We had been in the grip of a brutal cold snap for about a week. The temperature had been sitting between 5 and 15 degrees Fahrenheit every night, and during the day it wasn't getting much above 22. There had been a series of snowstorms, each one adding another few inches to what was already accumulating, and then on February 7th the forecasters started using words like historic and potentially record-breaking to describe what was coming. By 8 in the morning on February 8th, we had 8 new inches on the ground, and it was still coming down hard. Visibility was maybe a quarter mile. The wind was picking up and driving the snow sideways, and the radio was talking about wind chills approaching -20. My propane tank alarm had been going off since 6 in the morning. Not an emergency alarm, just the low-level monitoring app on my phone that notifies me when the tank drops below 15% capacity. I had actually been watching the level tick down all week because the heating system had been running almost continuously to keep those underground pipes warm. I had scheduled a delivery for February 3rd, but the storm on the 2nd had caused Ridgeline to cancel non-emergency routes. They had rescheduled me for the 8th. I was sitting at right around 12% when Mike Donahue, my regular driver from Ridgeline, called at about 7:45 in the morning to confirm he was still making my run despite the weather. "Roads are rough," he told me, "but we're deeming your delivery essential given your tank level and the forecast. Expect me around 9:30 at the latest." I thanked him, threw on my work boots, and went out to clear my driveway. I had a snowblower, a good one, a 2-stage Ariens that could handle wet, heavy snow, and I got to work. By 8:45 my driveway was reasonably clear, and I had spread a layer of ice melt on the approach. The street itself was bad, but the municipal plow had come through twice already, and it was manageable for a big truck with chains on its drives. At 8:57, I watched Sharon Whitmore's Cadillac Escalade come rolling down the street from the direction of the clubhouse, which was about 4 houses up from mine. She had clearly been doing her morning violation patrol even in a blizzard, which tells you everything you need to know about the woman. The Escalade pulled up slowly in front of my house, and I assumed she was going to cite me for the way I had piled the snow from my driveway at the edge of the street, which she had done to my neighbor Pete Larson last February. I figured I'd deal with whatever nonsense note she left and went inside to warm up with coffee. At 9:04 my phone rang. It was Mike from Ridgeline. "Hey James, I'm about a block away, but there's a vehicle blocking your driveway. Big SUV. Can't tell if they're going to move." I walked to my front window and I could not believe what I was seeing. Sharon's Escalade was parked perpendicular to my driveway, running, hazard lights on, blocking the entire entrance. She was standing next to it in a massive puffy white coat with a fur-lined hood, holding a clipboard, talking on her phone. I grabbed my coat and went outside. "Sharon," I said, walking up to her, trying to stay calm, "I've got a propane delivery coming right now. You need to move your vehicle." She held up one finger, the universal, "I'll get to you in a moment" gesture, and kept talking on her phone. I stood there in the blowing snow for a full 2 minutes. The Ridgeline truck had pulled up to the mouth of the street and was waiting, idling, which I could see from where I stood. When Sharon finally lowered her phone, she looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as pleasantly combative. "James," she said, "I was just finalizing a few notes on some violations I observed this morning. Your snow pile at the curb is exceeding the allowable boundary per HOA guidelines regarding snow removal and public right-of-way clearance. Sharon, I have a propane truck waiting. It needs to get into my driveway. Please move your vehicle." She looked over her shoulder at the truck like she was noticing it for the first time, which I absolutely do not believe was genuine. "That truck again," she said. "James, we've discussed this. Commercial delivery vehicles are subject to parking restrictions under HOA Rule 12. Sharon, I'm at 12% propane. It's 5 degrees out. I have heating cables running 24 hours a day. I need that delivery." She tilted her head in that particular way she had, the way that meant she had already decided what was happening and nothing I said would change it. "I'm going to need you to reschedule your delivery. Your propane situation is not an emergency by any legal standard, and the truck's presence in this neighborhood during a weather event represents a traffic safety concern I'm not comfortable approving. I want you to understand something here." Sharon Whitmore, a middle-aged woman with a clipboard, standing in a blizzard, was telling me she was not comfortable approving a propane delivery to my house. She had decided, on her own authority, that she could block my driveway to prevent a lawful utility delivery during a winter emergency and dress it up as an HOA rule enforcement action. "You don't have the authority to do this," I told her flatly. "I am acting in my capacity as HOA board president," she said. "I have the authority to enforce community regulations. You're obstructing a utility delivery. That's not HOA enforcement, that's interference with a lawful service." She smiled. It was the kind of smile that suggested she had a response for everything I might say. "The truck will need to reschedule. I'm sorry for the inconvenience." She turned and started writing on her clipboard. I walked away. Not because I was giving up, but because I needed to think clearly, and standing in a blizzard arguing with Sharon Whitmore was not going to get me anywhere. I called Mike from Ridgeline and told him to hold tight for a few minutes. He said he could give me 20 minutes max before his schedule required him to move on. I told him I understood. Then I called the non-emergency police line. I explained the situation calmly. The dispatcher said she'd send an officer when one was available, but with the storm, response times were extended and she couldn't guarantee anything under 45 minutes. 45 minutes was longer than I had. I called Phil Nakamura, the other board member who had shot down Sharon's towing idea 2 years ago. "Phil," I said, "Sharon is physically blocking my driveway with her Escalade to stop my propane delivery. I need you to call her and tell her as a board member that she doesn't have authority to do this." Phil swore under his breath. "I'll call her right now, James. This is insane," he called her. I watched through my front window as Sharon's phone rang and she looked at the screen and then she put it in her coat pocket without answering. Phil called me back. She didn't pick up. "Yeah, I watched that happen. James, I want you to document everything. Take video. This is not defensible behavior, and I will bring it to the full board." Meanwhile, the clock was ticking. Mike from Ridgeline had been sitting at the mouth of the street for 12 minutes. I went back outside and walked over to Sharon, this time with my phone up, recording video. "Sharon, I want to be clear for the record. You are intentionally blocking access to my residential driveway to prevent a propane delivery. You have been asked to move multiple times. You are refusing. You are doing this in a blizzard, in temperatures that are dangerous for extended propane outage. Is that correct?" She looked at the camera with practiced calm. I am enforcing HOA regulations to protect community standards, which regulation specifically requires you to park your personal vehicle in front of my driveway. She flipped through her clipboard. Rule 12, Section C, Commercial Vehicle Restrictions. That rule governs parking of commercial vehicles, not your personal vehicle blocking a residential driveway. You are not enforcing any rule right now. You are obstructing access to private property. She stopped writing. I could see something shift in her expression, just a flicker of uncertainty, but she recovered fast. The truck is the obstruction. My vehicle is positioned to prevent a traffic safety hazard. Your vehicle is the obstruction. My driveway is clear. The truck needs to enter it. You are blocking that entrance. She said nothing to that, just clicked her pen and went back to her clipboard. I had been out here long enough. I walked back to my garage, thought for about 30 seconds, and then I did something I had never needed to do before. I opened my basement door, went down to my mechanical room, and looked at the underground pipe heating system controller. The thermostat display showed outside ground temperature at the sensor points, and it was reading 21 degrees. The heating cables were running at full capacity. I had a manual override switch that could shut the whole system down, which I had never needed to use in 11 years of living here. Now, let me be extremely clear about what I was thinking in this moment, because I want you to understand that I did not do anything malicious or sneaky. I did not shut the system off. I want to be very clear about that. What I did do is look at the system and realize something that I had honestly never fully thought through before in practical terms. If Sharon succeeded in preventing this delivery and my propane ran out, my heating system would shut down. My underground pipe heating cables would go cold, and that 30-foot loop that ran under the corner of Sharon's yard, the one she had no idea existed, would stop generating heat in a blizzard with temperatures near zero. And eventually, within hours, the ground in that corridor would start freezing hard, and the water service lines running through that corridor would become very vulnerable. I went back upstairs, called Mike one more time. Mike, I want to be straight with you. There's a neighbor blocking my driveway. Police are coming, but it might be a while. Are you able to wait? He was quiet for a second. Tell you what, my supervisor knows the situation. You're an essential delivery because of your tank level. We can give it another 15 minutes. After that, I've got to move or my dispatcher pulls me. I could potentially come back later today, but I can't promise a window. 15 minutes. I thought about what else I could do. Then I thought about my neighbor across the street, Tom Brightwell, who was a retired attorney. Not a real estate attorney. He had been a corporate litigator, but he was sharp and he had dealt with the HOA before on a fence dispute. I called Tom, explained the whole thing in about 90 seconds. Tom laughed. Not a funny ha-ha laugh, but that low, controlled laugh that certain types of very confident men make when they see an obvious answer. She's creating a private nuisance and potentially obstructing a utility service. Does she own any of the road in front of your house? It's a public street. Then she has zero legal basis to block your driveway with her private vehicle, regardless of what HOA rule she thinks she's enforcing. The HOA governs residents' conduct on their own properties, not their ability to physically obstruct access to other people's properties using personal vehicles. She's outside the scope of the HOA entirely. You could have her vehicle towed. I don't want to escalate to towing her car. Fair enough. Can you get a vehicle out of your garage to box her out? I blinked. I had a second vehicle. My truck, a full-size Chevy, was in my garage. If I pulled it out and positioned it on the other side of her Escalade, she couldn't block the whole width of the driveway entrance. The Ridgeline truck would still need about 14 feet of clear width to make the approach. If I pulled my truck out to one side, Sharon would have to either move her Escalade completely or the Ridgeline truck could potentially squeeze past on the other side. I called Mike. Mike, I'm going to pull my truck out. If I can get you a path that's wide enough, can you make it work? He thought about it. What's the total width at the entrance? I measured by eye. Sharon's Escalade was about 7 feet wide. She was parked at roughly a 45-degree angle across my driveway entrance, which was about 20 feet wide. She was not blocking the full width. She was blocking the center, which was where the truck needed to go, but the proportions of her positioning left gaps on either end. Probably 9-10 feet on the left side of her car, I told him. My truck is 9'2" at the mirrors, Mike said, and I could hear him smiling. If you can give me a straight shot without any snow pile on that edge, I can thread it. I hung up, jumped in my Chevy, and pulled it out of the garage. I positioned it on the right side of my driveway entrance, which effectively closed off any ambiguity about where the path was, and signaled clearly to Sharon that the left side approach was the lane we'd be using. Sharon watched all this from next to her Escalade with an expression that suggested she was calculating rapidly. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "Coordinating my delivery," I said cheerfully. She glanced at the gap on her left side and seemed to realize what was about to happen. She moved toward her Escalade, and for a moment I thought she was going to move it. Instead, she pulled forward about 2 feet, which closed the gap she'd been leaving on the left side. She hadn't moved her car out of the way. She had tightened the blockade. I called Mike. She just closed the gap. How much room is there now? I looked. Maybe 4 feet on either side of her Escalade. Not enough. Mike sighed. "James, I'm going to have to reschedule. I'm sorry. I'll mark this as an obstruction on my end and document it. My dispatcher will note it as an access denial, and we can potentially get you an emergency delivery later today or first thing tomorrow. You've got maybe 6 to 8 hours at your current draw rate before you hit critical. Try to cut your thermostat back to conserve." I had already started doing the math on that. If I dropped my interior thermostat to 55 and shut off the propane fireplace in the living room, I could stretch my remaining propane to maybe 10 or 12 hours. The underground pipe heating system would stay on because it drew from the same tank and I absolutely needed it running. In fact, at these temperatures, the underground system was the priority. Mike drove away. I stood in my driveway in the blowing snow and watched the Ridgeline truck disappear around the corner. Sharon Whitmore straightened up beside her Escalade with the air of someone who had just won a tennis match. "I do hope you'll reconsider the scheduling of commercial deliveries going forward, James," she said. "The community standards exist for a reason." I looked at her for a long moment. "Sharon," I said quietly, "I genuinely hope you have a warm day." Something about my tone apparently struck her as odd because her expression flickered for just a second. Then she got back in her Escalade and drove away. I went inside and started documenting everything. I uploaded the video I had taken to my computer and made 3 copies in different locations. I sent a copy to Phil Nakamura with a note explaining everything that had happened. I sent another to my own personal email archive and one to a cloud folder. I wrote up a detailed timeline with timestamps, including Mike's call log and the contact I had made with the police non-emergency line. Then I called my propane company's customer service line and officially documented the access denial, making sure they noted in their system that a neighbor had deliberately blocked the delivery vehicle. Then I called Ridgeline's emergency line and explained my situation. They told me they had a priority emergency delivery window that could potentially slot me in for late afternoon, around 4 p.m., if no other emergency calls came in before then. They told me to call back at 2 p.m. to confirm. For the next several hours, I managed my propane use carefully. I turned my main thermostat down to 58 degrees, closed the vents to rooms I wasn't using, put on an extra sweater and monitored my tank level through the app. The underground pipe heating cable stayed on. That was non-negotiable. Ground temperature at the sensor was hovering around 19 degrees and the cables were working hard. Around noon, something interesting happened. My phone rang and it was Dorothy Sims, the 3rd board member. "James," she said without preamble, "I just heard from Phil about what happened this morning. I want you to know this is being addressed." What Sharon did was completely outside the scope of her authority, and I'm calling an emergency board meeting for Monday evening. I appreciate that, Dorothy. I also want you to know that Phil and I are both prepared to vote to formally censure her for this action if it's established that she deliberately obstructed your delivery. We may also be looking at whether her conduct constitutes a breach of her fiduciary duty as board president. That last part surprised me. Fiduciary duty. Board members have a duty to act in the interest of the community and to follow established law. Deliberately blocking a utility delivery in sub-zero temperatures could arguably expose the HOA to liability if anything had gone wrong. We take that seriously. I told her I would provide all documentation I had, and I would. We hung up and I went and made some soup on the stove because I was cold, and also because stoves make heat. At about 2 in the afternoon, while I was watching the snow finally start to ease up outside, my phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor 3 houses down, a young woman named Cassie Ortiz, who I knew had had her own run-ins with Sharon over a vegetable garden she grew in her front yard. The text said, "James, did Sharon really block your propane truck this morning?" I texted back a short explanation. Within about 10 minutes my phone was buzzing with messages from half a dozen neighbors. Apparently word had gotten around fast. Pete Larson, who Sharon had cited for the snow pile violation last year, texted me a string of furious messages. Gerald Patterson, the retired teacher with the mailbox, called me on the phone and said in his quiet way, "I hope you're all right, James, and I hope she learned something from this." Tom Brightwell from across the street sent me a text that just said, "Document everything. Don't engage emotionally. Let it play out." Around 3 in the afternoon, with the blizzard finally winding down to flurries, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a woman named Corinne Schultz from the county's Office of Consumer Affairs, and I nearly dropped the phone. "Mr. Webb," she said, "we received a complaint referral from Ridgeline Propane regarding an access obstruction that prevented a propane delivery during today's winter emergency." As you may know, the county declared a Level 2 winter emergency this morning, and under County Ordinance 8314, deliberately obstructing access to utility services during a declared winter emergency is a civil violation and potentially a criminal one depending on intent and circumstances. "We're opening a case file. Can you tell me what happened?" I told her everything. I read her my timestamps. I told her about the video I had. She asked me to email everything to a case number she gave me. I did it while we were still on the phone. When I got off with her, I called Mike at Ridgeline. I told him about the county office call. He said that was good, because Ridgeline had also filed a report with their trade association and flagged the incident internally. He confirmed my 4 p.m. delivery slot was still available. At exactly 4:17 in the afternoon, the Ridgeline truck came back down Birchwood Lane. My driveway was clear. There was no Cadillac Escalade in sight. Mike backed the truck in, connected the hose to my fill port, and stood there in the fading afternoon light filling my tank while I stood in my garage doorway watching the level percentage climb on my phone app. When it hit 85%, Mike shut off the valve, disconnected the hose, and handed me the paperwork. "Good luck with your neighbor," he said. "I have a feeling she's going to need more luck than me," I told him. He drove away and I went inside and turned my thermostat back up to a normal temperature and felt the blessed warmth of natural air circulation coming through the vents. I made dinner, watched some television, and went asleep in a warm house. I thought that was going to be the end of the active drama, at least until the Monday board meeting. I was wrong. At 6:43 in the morning on February 9th, 27 degrees outside, 2 inches of fresh light snow overnight, I received a frantic knock on my front door. I opened it in my robe and slippers and found Sharon Whitmore standing on my porch. She looked terrible, not physically hurt, but the kind of terrible that comes from a night of genuine stress. Her hair was not its usual perfect self. She had mascara tracked down one cheek that she clearly hadn't noticed yet. "My kitchen pipes are frozen," she said. Now here is the moment I had been thinking about since I stood in my basement the previous morning and did the math on what would happen if my propane ran out. I had not run out of propane, thanks to the 4 p.m. delivery. My underground pipe heating system had run continuously all night, which meant it had been running all night in that 30-foot loop under the corner of her yard, which meant her pipes should not have been frozen. So I was confused for a moment, and I asked her to explain what was happening. She told me that when she'd gotten up this morning, the kitchen faucet had no pressure. She'd checked under the sink and the pipes were cold. The plumber she'd called couldn't come until 10. She was without water in her kitchen. She had heard from someone, she didn't say who, that I had some kind of underground heating system. She had come to ask if I could help. I invited her inside because the porch was cold. I poured her a cup of coffee because I'm not actually a monster, even if she had cost me a very stressful day. Then I asked her a few questions. Her frozen pipe, it turned out, was not in the corridor served by my underground heating cable. It was a different pipe, one that ran through an uninsulated section of her exterior wall under the kitchen sink. This was a completely separate issue from the underground system I maintained, and it was the kind of problem any house could have in extreme cold. The two things were unrelated. I explained this to her. I explained that my underground heating cable ran under a corner of her backyard, covering the water service line corridor in that area, and it had been running all night. Her kitchen pipe problem was something else entirely, likely the undersink pipe in the exterior wall. She stared at me. "You have a heating cable under my yard. It's documented in the property easement," I said. "I can show you the deed language if you'd like." She opened her mouth, closed it. "How long has that been there?" "It was installed before I bought the house. 11 years ago at least, probably closer to 15. It's in the property records." Another silence. I could see several things happening behind her eyes simultaneously. The recognition that there was infrastructure under her property that she had no idea about. The recognition that it was legal and documented. The recognition that it was there specifically because of my system and my utility setup. And probably, somewhere in there, the dawning realization of what would have happened if she had succeeded in blocking my propane delivery and my tank had run out, and that underground system had gone cold. I did not point this out to her. I did not need to. "My kitchen pipe," she said finally. "Your kitchen pipe is a different issue. What you probably have is freezing in the wall cavity. Classic exterior wall problem. You want to open the cabinet doors under the sink and aim a space heater at it on low, no higher, never high setting near a pipe, and let it thaw slowly. Do not use a hair dryer or heat gun directly on the pipe because you can crack it if it's already stressed, and call your plumber anyway to have it checked once it thaws." She looked at me in a way I had not seen her look at anyone before. It was the look of someone realizing that the person they have been treating as an enemy has just given them genuinely useful information without any apparent agenda. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. It was probably the most honest question Sharon Whitmore had asked anyone in years. "Because you need help with a plumbing issue," I said simply. "That's not complicated." She left about 10 minutes later. I don't know if she said thank you. I honestly can't remember. She might have, she might not have. Either way, I went back to my breakfast. The Monday night HOA board meeting was held in the community clubhouse, and I have to tell you it was the most attended HOA meeting in the history of Cedarwood Estates. Normally, these things drew 8 or 10 people. This one had 43. People had heard about the propane truck incident, and apparently a fair number of people had a list of grievances they had been holding onto for some time, and the news that Phil and Dorothy were prepared to formally challenge Sharon's conduct had encouraged people to show up and say things. I arrived early with a folder of printed documentation, my video of the incident, the call log, the timestamp record, the email I'd sent to Phil immediately after the incident, the County Consumer Affairs case number, the Ridgeline Propane Company's incident documentation, my written timeline. I had everything. Phil Nakamura opened the meeting and stated clearly that the purpose of the emergency session was to address a specific complaint regarding the conduct of board president Sharon Whitmore on February 8th. Sharon was seated at the board table looking composed but tight around the eyes. Phil asked me to present my account. I stood up and gave a clean, factual account of what had happened, without dramatics, without editorializing. I showed the video on the clubhouse projector. You could hear it in the room, that collective quiet that happens when people watch something and realize it's worse than they had imagined. There was Sharon on the screen, in her puffy white coat, calmly explaining to me why she was blocking my driveway during a blizzard. When the video finished, Phil asked Sharon if she wanted to respond. Sharon gave a prepared statement about community standards and the importance of consistent enforcement and traffic safety concerns during weather events. It was polished and it sounded reasonable in isolation, but after watching that video, it landed very flat. A few people in the back of the room made audible sounds of skepticism. Then Dorothy Sims said something that shifted the room entirely. "Sharon," she said, in that careful, measured tone that nurses use when they want you to pay attention, "I want to read you something from our own HOA governing documents, specifically the board member code of conduct that we all signed when we joined the board." She opened a folder. Quote, "Board members shall at all times act in a manner consistent with applicable federal, state, and local law, and shall not take any action in their board capacity that infringes upon the legal rights of any resident or third party." End quote. Refusing to allow a propane delivery during a county-declared winter emergency to a resident at 12% tank capacity does not comply with this standard. You are not enforcing an HOA rule. You are using your vehicle to physically block access to a neighbor's property. Those are two very different things. Sharon started to respond. Phil cut her off gently but firmly. "I'd also like to note," Phil said, "that the County Office of Consumer Affairs has opened a case file based on the incident. We have been made aware that Sharon's actions may constitute a violation of County Ordinance 8314, which covers obstruction of utility services during declared emergencies. The HOA's attorney has advised us that this exposure creates potential liability for the association if we do not take appropriate action." The room was very quiet now. Phil continued, "Dorothy and I are placing a motion on the floor to formally censure Sharon Whitmore for conduct unbecoming a board member, specifically the deliberate obstruction of a utility delivery on February 8th, in violation of her board member code of conduct and applicable county ordinance. We are also recommending suspension of her board authority pending the outcome of the county's investigation. The motion requires a majority vote of the present board membership." Dorothy has already seconded the motion. "I am voting yes." "Dorothy?" "Yes," Dorothy said. Both of them looked at Sharon. Under the HOA's bylaws, a board member could not vote on a motion that directly concerned their own conduct. Sharon knew this. She sat back in her chair. The motion passed 2-0 with one abstention by operation of the bylaws. Sharon Whitmore was formally censured, and her board authority was suspended pending the county investigation. The room exhaled. Then several people started talking at once, and Phil called for order. And for the next hour and a half, the meeting turned into the most productive community conversation Cedarwood Estates had ever had. People raised concerns about enforcement practices going back years. Gerald Patterson talked about his mailbox. Pete Larson talked about the snow pile citation. Cassie Ortiz talked about her vegetable garden. 7 other people had stories. Phil and Dorothy listened to all of it, took notes, and committed to reviewing each complaint through the proper process. By the time the meeting ended, there was a strong sense in that room that something had cracked open and the air was coming in. Not hostile air, not vindictive air, but the kind of honest community discussion that should have been happening all along. Sharon left the meeting before it concluded. I watched her go. Over the following 2 weeks things moved quickly. The County Consumer Affairs investigation concluded that Sharon's actions did constitute a civil violation of the Winter Emergency Utility Obstruction Ordinance. She was assessed a fine. It was not a criminal charge, which was appropriate given the circumstances. She had not intended physical harm to anyone. She had not been violent. She had been obstinate and power-drunk and entitled. But the county's determination was civil rather than criminal, and I think that was right. The HOA's attorney sent Sharon a formal letter outlining the board's findings and the conditions for her to resume board participation, which included completing a board governance training course and agreeing to a modified enforcement protocol that required her to consult with at least one other board member before issuing any new violation notice. Sharon came to the following regular board meeting. She sat in the audience rather than at the board table, which told you a lot about where things stood. She did not speak during the public comment period. She did not bring her clipboard. She had a thermos of coffee, which she kept both hands wrapped around, and she looked like someone who had spent 2 weeks doing serious thinking. I don't know exactly what that thinking produced for her. I'm not inside her head. But I will tell you that she did not block my driveway again. She did not issue me any new violation notices. When Ridgeland came for my spring fill in late April, the truck backed into my driveway without incident and nobody said a word. About 3 weeks after the blizzard, I was out in my yard on a Saturday afternoon doing some early season assessment of winter damage, checking on the fence line, looking at where the snow had piled against the foundation, that kind of thing. Sharon came out of her back door across the property line fence, bundled in a quilted jacket, her hands in her pockets. She stood at the fence for a moment. "James," she said. I looked up. "I owe you an apology." She said it quickly, like she was getting it out before she changed her mind. What I did in February was wrong. I was wrong about the rule application, and I was wrong to use my car the way I did, and I was wrong not to listen to you when you explained the situation. I put down the notebook I had been carrying. I also, she continued, owe you a thank you for helping me with the pipe problem. You didn't have to do that. Neighbor thing, I said. She nodded slowly. I haven't been very neighborly. I wasn't going to argue that point with her. Instead, I said, I accept the apology, Sharon. I don't hold grudges. I just want things to work correctly. She seemed to appreciate that. She went back inside without a lot of ceremony, which was actually the right call. Long emotional resolutions are overrated. Short ones that mean what they say are better. Phil Nakamura called me that evening. He had heard about the conversation from Dorothy, who had somehow heard about it through the neighborhood grapevine, which in Cedarwood Estates moved faster than the municipal plow. How was she? He asked. Genuine, I think, I said. She's still Sharon, but I think she scared herself a little with how far she went. The county fine helped with that, Phil said dryly. Probably. James, I want to ask you something. The board is going to need to rewrite several sections of the enforcement protocol, specifically around board member authority and the process for dispute resolution. Dorothy and I have been working on it, but we could use input from a resident who's been on the other end of some of these issues. Would you be willing to sit on a small advisory committee? I thought about it for about 3 seconds. Yeah, I said. I'd do that. The advisory committee met 4 times over the following 2 months. It included me, Tom Brightwell, the retired attorney from across the street, Cassie Ortiz, Gerald Patterson, and 2 other residents. Phil and Dorothy participated from the board side. What came out of it was a revised enforcement protocol that required documented evidence before any violation notice could be issued, a mandatory 30-day response window for residents to contest violations, and a clear prohibition on board members using any personal conduct, including the physical presence of their own vehicles, as a means of enforcing HOA regulations. That last one was added specifically because of February 8th, and everyone in the room knew it, and no one said so out loud, which is the polite way to handle these things. The revised protocol was ratified by the full board and sent to every homeowner in the community. It ran to 4 pages and was genuinely readable, which put it ahead of most HOA documents in the country. Spring came to Cedarwood Estates. The snow melted. The underground pipe heating system went into standby mode, its thermostat satisfied that ground temperatures had climbed above its trigger threshold. My propane tank sat at a comfortable 68% heading into the warm months. The Ridgeline truck would come again in September for a fall top-off, and it would back into my driveway the same way it always had, and everything would be fine. Cassie Ortiz replanted her front yard vegetable garden, and nobody said anything about it. Gerald Patterson's mailbox continued to stand at its slight angle, uncontested. Pete Larson piled his snow wherever he needed to pile it, and nobody cited him for it. Sharon Whitmore completed her board governance training and returned to the board table in May. She was quieter than she used to be. She still brought her thermos and she still took notes, but the nature of the notes had changed. They were less about what she planned to cite people for and more about what the community actually needed. She pushed through a proposal to have the community entrance sign repainted, which everyone agreed needed to happen. She organized a spring cleanup event that turned out pretty well. Small stuff, practical stuff, the kind of thing an HOA is actually supposed to do. I won't tell you she became a different person, because I don't think people become fundamentally different people. I think what happened is that Sharon Whitmore, for the first time in a few years, ran into a situation where her usual approach ran straight into actual consequences, documented and legal and unavoidable. And somewhere in the process of dealing with those consequences, she found the edge of what her authority actually was and decided to stay inside it, which is all anyone ever wanted from her. I've thought about that morning a fair amount since it happened. The blizzard howling, my propane app ticking down, Sharon standing there in her white puffy coat with her clipboard, absolutely certain that the authority she had built for herself in this small corner of a Maryland suburb was sufficient to hold back a propane truck and a winter emergency and the legal rights of her neighbor. There's something almost sad about that level of confidence. Almost. But here's the thing I keep coming back to. The part that I find most satisfying about how the whole thing unfolded is not the county fine, or the board censure, or even the video on the projector screen at the community meeting. What I find most satisfying is the image of Sharon Whitmore standing on my porch at 6:43 in the morning, in yesterday's mascara, asking for help with a frozen pipe. Because at that moment, every bit of the HOA board president had been stripped away, and she was just a neighbor with a problem who had come to another neighbor for help. And I gave it to her, because that's what neighbors do, even complicated ones, even the ones who blocked your propane truck in a blizzard. The underground heating cables are still there, running through their loop under the corner of her yard. They'll run again this winter and every winter after that. They were there before Sharon was on the board, and they'll be there long after the whole drama of February 8th has faded into neighborhood folklore, which it already has. Last month at a block party, someone I barely knew came up to me and said they'd heard about the propane truck story. And the way they told it back to me, it had grown some details that definitely hadn't happened, including at one point a detail where apparently I had threatened to shut off the underground heating cables as leverage, which I want to be absolutely clear I never did and would never do. I told the person that wasn't quite how it happened, and they looked a little disappointed, and I thought about it for a second and said, the actual version is better. And it is. The actual version is better because nobody had to do anything dishonest. I didn't manipulate anything. I didn't use the heating cable situation as a threat. I documented what happened. I followed the right processes. I gave the evidence to the right people, and the right people did their jobs. The county enforced its ordinance. The board followed its governing documents. The neighbors showed up at the meeting and told their stories. The system worked. The HOA is supposed to protect property values and maintain community standards, and give neighbors a framework for living next to each other without everything turning into a lawsuit. When it works, it's genuinely useful. When one person decides the HOA is a personal enforcement empire and they are its emperor, the whole thing breaks down. The fix for that isn't anarchy. The fix is documentation, bylaws, a few good people on the board who take their responsibility seriously, and one delivery driver who was willing to wait an extra 20 minutes while a neighbor sorted out a situation. Thanks, Mike. The man deserves a mention. I had one more moment with Sharon that first summer after all of it. July late afternoon, I was backing my truck out of the garage and she was walking her dog past my house, a small white terrier I had never seen before that she apparently got in the spring. She waved at me from the sidewalk. I waved back. The dog sniffed at the edge of my grass. New dog, I called. Got her in April, Sharon said. Her name is Biscuit. Good name, I said. James, she said, and stopped walking for a moment. For what it's worth, I am aware that my heating system would have had a very bad winter if you hadn't gotten that propane delivered. I looked at her. You figured out the connection. Eventually, she said, she gave Biscuit's leash a gentle pull. I did my homework. Well, I said, the easement is in the public record if you ever want to review it. I've already read it, she said. 3 times. She almost smiled. You have a good evening, James. You too, Sharon. Biscuit pulled her down the sidewalk and they went around the bend in the lane and out of sight. I sat in my truck for a moment with the engine running and the window down and the warm July air coming through, and I thought about how strange and complicated and occasionally satisfying it is to live in close proximity to other people, with shared roads and shared rules and underground cables running through each other's yards, keeping each other's pipes warm whether anyone knows it or not. I put the truck in reverse and backed out into the sun. 14 Birchwood Lane, Cedarwood Estates, home.